Whenever you did these things for any of the least of my people, you did it for me. A few moments ago, Margaret read for us a chunk of a sermon from a far better preacher than I'll ever be, but I'd like to add a couple of thoughts to it. This passage that we just heard is from the last sermon that Jesus gave according to the gospel writer Matthew. And it echoes that first sermon of Jesus, his most famous sermon, the Sermon on the... Oh, you're there. Sermon on the Mount. Jesus preaches this last sermon about the sheep and the goats during the last week of his life. It comes after marching through the streets on Palm Sunday, after his act of civil disobedience in the temple, turning over the tables of the money manipulators and the souvenir sellers. Jesus preaches it just before his arrest and trial for sedition and blasphemy and disturbing the peace. Of course, according to Matthew, Jesus preaches a lot. You know, every gospel writer has their own take on the Jesus event. We sometimes focus on the similarities of at least those first three gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In fact, here's how I think of it. Matthew and Luke seem to crib a lot from Mark and from this other mysterious source, Q, short for Quelle in German, which means source. Clever. I think of it like this. When we were all back in high school, maybe there was a final exam, and I picture Matthew and Luke placing themselves strategically at the desks just behind their buddies Mark and Q, who actually studied for the exam. And John, I kind of think John missed the exam. He had to take the makeup a week later. In my own... Say a little prayer for whoever is going in that ambulance. But in my own grappling with the Gospels, I'm always drawn not to what makes them similar, but to how each depiction of Jesus is a bit different, not in essentials, but in emphasis. So in Mark's Gospel, we have action figure Jesus. Mark's favorite word is then, as in, then Jesus did this, and then Jesus did that. Mark focuses primarily on what Jesus does. Luke wants to tell us about storyteller Jesus, and so he gives us the great parables, including the two that are probably most famous, the prodigal son and the Good Samaritan. In John's gospel, we find miracle worker Jesus. So in John, Jesus gives sight to a man born blind, brings back his friend Lazarus out of the tomb, and he prevents a bloodthirsty, hypocritical mob from stoning to death a woman they think is immoral. Jesus changes their minds. He changes their hearts, which is probably the biggest miracle in the book, right? So that's John's Jesus. I think Matthew shows us a different side of Jesus. Jesus as a preacher. His Sermon on the Mount goes on for 3 chapters, right into brunch hour. That sermon includes, of course, the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor and the meek and the peacemakers. Blessed are the despised and the slandered. The Sermon on the Mount includes the commandment to turn the other cheek and to love our enemies. It includes those words, do not worry about your clothes, about your food, about your life, which is probably the most ignored commandment of Jesus. But today we come to this final sermon in Matthew. We could call it the Sermon on the Mount of Olives, because that's where he is, up on the Mount of Olives. Lee and I spent a little time on the Mount of Olives a few years ago with a group of pastors and rabbis that we were traveling with, and it's more kind of ongoing slope than mount, but there are olives growing on it here and there. In Matthew 25, Jesus has left the city of Jerusalem. It's gotten a little hot for him in there. The people in charge of the city are feeling threatened by him. They've infiltrated his movement. Remember Judas? They have plans to arrest him and put him in jail and put him on trial, maybe even kill him. Anything to stop this guy from preaching. Anything to squelch the message that he's trying to put out there. And what is the message? We have it here. Jesus tells those who follow him to the Mount of Olives that people aren't going to be judged by God so much on the basis of their religion. They won't be judged by God so much on the basis of their faith or their lack of it. Faith is a gift. It gets you through the day. It helps you do what you need to do, what you know you need to do. But it's not some requirement for the kingdom of heaven, according to preacher Jesus here preaching on the Mount of Olives. This is kind of radical stuff. This is a radical sermon. Radical teaching. No wonder why we in the church so often ignore it. What you believe is for you. What you do with what you believe is for God, Jesus is saying in this passage. And when your faith is on straight, your actions are going to flow out of there. These righteous people, these people who embody God's justice, aren't even aware of it, of course. They're righteous, but they're not self-righteous. And Jesus says in that other sermon, the Sermon on the Mount, don't make some big deal about doing the right thing. Just do it. Don't even let your right hand know what your left hand's doing, says Jesus. Don't make a big deal about it even to yourself. Don't feel all smug about it. Just do it and shut up, says Jesus. It's my translation. But I love it that the righteous people are confused when Jesus tells them and praises them for what they've been doing. And they ask, when did we see you hungry and feed you? When did we see you thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you were a stranger and invite you to live here? When did we see that you needed clothes and give you some? When did we see you sick and provide health care? When did we know you were incarcerated and come to see you? Jesus sets them straight. When you did it for anybody, when you did it for anybody, when you did it for somebody everybody else was ignoring, when you did it for somebody people told you not to bother about, when you did it for somebody even that you didn't necessarily like, somebody who you knew couldn't pay you back, you did it for me. You did it for me. Jesus says, I know you by your commitment to people that the world sees as the least and the last and the lost. I know you by your commitment to the disparaged and discouraged and discarded, the ostracized and the marginalized. That's how I know you. I know you by your commitment to the people who need me. I know you. I see you. Another preacher said to me once, not long ago, with everything your church is trying to do, your people must really, really be committed. And then she paused and she said, or else y'all should be committed. But I think that's kind of true of the Christian movement. To do the things, right? To do all the things that Jesus asks us to do, wants us to do, you got to be a little bit nuts, right? You got to be a little bit nuts. So it always strikes me how in the parable of the sheep and the goats, the righteous sheep are so mystified at this praise from Jesus. When did we see you do all the things? Because to them, they were just doing what they do. The other day, I ran into Fatima in the hallway, and she was so ecstatic. She had collected and given away 70 coats to migrant farmers who had come by for help. Migrant families. To migrant families who had come by for some help. I'm so happy, she said. And she was. But half an hour later, she came up practically in tears because somebody had come into church barefoot. Somebody had stolen his shoes at the shelter that he was staying at. And it hurt her to see. And she was not going to be okay until she found some socks and dug up some shoes that were going to fit him. We can't all be Fatima, right? I can't be Fatima. Lord knows I can't be Fatima. But we can each do something. We can each do something to make sure God's people are fed and clothed and sheltered and visited. As Jesus followers, that's our commitment. And our commitment to a community that tries to make all that happen.